Okay, in previous lesson we talked about exporting high poly meshes from a speed tree for VFX applications and to be used in movies or animations or things like that. Things are that going to be pre-rendered. And now we are in a speed tree modeler and we're going to export these for games format, which is a bit different to VFX applications because now we need to have the target hardware in mind as well, and we want to be as efficient as possible and as optimized as possible. And although in here you can export the way that we exported for cinema version using this export mesh, but now we're going to use to export to game to be able to optimize this one further. And if you go and hit this icon export mesh, then you're getting the same window. You need to assign the name for it, and you get the same old window that we saw in the previous lesson. But we really do not want to do that. And the option that we're going to use is the export to game, which is shortcut Control plus E. And it brings you this dialog, and you need to choose the format that you're going to use. One is ST and one is ST9, which is a newer one for Unreal Engine or whatever software that you're going to export. And of course, you can export as OBJ and FBX as well to use it wherever you want it. And of course, you can export for Unity, Unreal Engine, and Lumberyard. And the first option is .st, which is an old one. And since I'm going to use this one for Unreal Engine, the ST9 is going to be the newer version, which is a bit improved. So I'm fine with the naming. Let's hit save. And it's telling us that the wind is not going to be for games, so no problem. Hit continue. And now it's going to bring a dialog that if it's your first time to export, you can use some of the presets. So hit OK, and these are some of the presets that we are seeing here. So I'm going to set it to UE4 one draw call because one draw call is a lot more optimized, and it sets up the preset for us. And one option that we have is show atlas, and if you hit it, you're going to get the atlases that you used in this, and this is going to be a representative of the material. But in here we are only seeing the base color, but the whole material is going to be exported. Since we used 3 different materials on this, if we export this using multiple materials, it's going to create a lot of draw calls, and it's not going to be so optimized for games. So the speed tree algorithm uses this atlasing system to place all of them inside one UV space, so that when we export out of a speed tree to Unreal Engine, for example, we are only getting one material per object, which makes it more optimized than having, for example, 3 different materials assigned to one object. And also you can take them, you can bring them, move them, and rescale them, rotate them, do whatever you want to do with them. The first one is for moving, this one is for rotating, this one is for a scale uniform. It's going to scale the island in all of the axes to the same value, and this one is scale non-uniform. So you see, we are doing something like that and scaling to the degree that we want it. So let's tell that this one isn't so important for us. We're going to decrease the size because not a lot of the mesh is taken by this UV island. So I'm bringing this here, and on these two I'm going to rescale them just a bit. And of course you should place them in the 0 to 1 UV space as well. Something like that, and you should avoid overlapping UVs. So one of the most important options for exporting is this LOD section. If you hit this highest only, it's going to export the highest LOD possible only, which is this one. And it's going to only show this and not doing that LOD system that we created for it. And if you hit all LODs, it's going to use this LOD system to make it optimized and show a more simplified version of the mesh in different distances. For example, showing the highest complexity when the player is so close to it, and showing only a simple mesh with a lot of optimized polygons in the far distances. And it's a good trick to use. And the next one is LODs plus billboard. And the billboard is something that is used in games for optimization purposes. Let me open a tree. For example, this pine tree that we created. Billboard is something like this. It goes to orthographic views, for example, in this side angle, and taking a screenshot from here. Of course, it's not including any of the environment in here. It's only including the color information plus the opacity and map it onto a single plane so that in really, really far distances, instead of showing geometry, it shows that simple plane with that screenshot. That one is called the billboard. And the billboard is going to be taken from different sides. For example, from right side, from left side, from top side, and every angle that you're looking at the mesh in really far distances, it's going to only show that. For example, in really far distance, you really do not need to have any geometry. So in such a distance, it's going to only show you a plane with that material as a cutout mesh so that it becomes very, very optimized for really long distances. So depending on your workflow, you might want to have LODs and billboard turned on, for example, especially for trees that you make. So again, I'm going to hit export and I'm going to go for ST9, which is a newer version. So doesn't matter. And now let's set it for UE4 one draw call. And the billboard only, it's going to only export the billboards and not LODs and real geometry. So for you to take a better idea of what billboard is, I'm going to export only as a billboard. So doesn't matter. I'm only going to export as billboards and hit OK. And this is the billboard that it has taken. From every angle, it has created a screenshot and placed it onto this atlas. So when going far away, it's going to create a simple plane around every of these meshes and using some mathematics showing one of them at every time so that the mesh would be camera facing. And this has not only taken the orthographic views. For example, here only going to XZ plane or YZ plane and things like that. You see in here we have only 3 orthographic views, but instead it has gone over and took a 360 degrees tour around the mesh and taking a screenshot from every angle so that whenever we look at this from far away, we are seeing details. And it has only exported some of them which are necessary. The first one is the color map. Of course, with this color map, we are seeing the opacity map. You see this is a PNG map with opacity in mind, and these white places are not really anything. It's only opacity. And you can see right through these white parts in the game. And the next one is the normal to give it a bit of detail in further places, and subsurface to make the subsurface happening as well. So this was the billboard. And mostly for exporting trees and things like that, you want to have billboards turned on for maximum optimization. So let's go for other exporting options as well. So again, let's go for UE4 one draw call only and LOD plus billboards. The next category is include, and this one, vertex blend, is a bit advanced and we are not going to talk about it. But the light map UVs, we created them in here, and to see what the light map UVs are, you want to go in here and you remember that we set up the light map UV for this, and the light map UV ideally should be green. And of course, if you are making some parts blue, doesn't matter for games applications. You want the part that the player is going to be seeing the most to be green and avoid any red in there. So if you want to have maximum optimization, you want to set the parts that the player is going to interact with to be green and lesser important parts to be blue as well. Since if you go, for example, to here and go to light mapping, you can make everything in every tree in here to be green by increasing the resolution. But if the mesh is going to be too small, you want to set this to be really small as well. And avoid going, for example, something like 1024 on a grass or a simple tree to make everything green. So it takes a bit of experimentations to know how this works. And you want to be as optimal as possible, normally selecting low resolution for light maps. So these two gone, the first option is the variations. And these variations are in here, in this menu. You see these variation colors. If you add variations, for example, let me bring in this color, you see the color of these changes. And if I drag it back, the color comes back. And let's say that, for example, you add some custom variations in here and making one red, for example. This is to be an example, and you really do not want to use something like this in the model that you're exporting out. And if you include the variation and go to show atlas, you see the normal materials that we have here and also the red-green variation that we added. And this is later on going to be multiplied on top of the texture and making that something like this. And if you decide not to include it, you're only going to export these. So have that in mind as well. And that works like this. I brought the amount down and now we're getting the blend between the variation color and the UV cluster that we had. And every amount of variation that you add, for example, if you have a lot of instances and you add the variation, it's going to add them on top in here. So depending on your needs, you might want to have the variations on or turned off. So the next option is using the atlas. And the first option is totally ignoring it and not creating an atlas, which for real-time game trees is not really recommended. You want to be as efficient as possible, and it's good even if you place a whole tree inside an atlas to make it only one draw call, because these are going to be instanced in the game, and something like a grass may be instanced millions of times in the game, so you want to be as efficient as possible and every time using only one draw call. So none means not creating an atlas, and everything puts everything inside this 0 to 1 UV space. And if you have a complex tree, for example, it's going to place that in here no matter what. And it's going to be the most optimized. And this one, if the geometry isn't going to fit into this 0 to 1 UV space, it's going to create another atlas for you. And you can visit that here if it creates another atlas. But since all of these are stored in the 0 to 1 UV space, it's not creating an atlas. So the next option is allow separate atlases. And if you want to create different atlases for the tree, for example, if I go in here in this atlas, typing a name, for example, 01, and go to export this again, just like always, and go into show atlases, you see now we have the default section, which are these that are unnamed, and we have 01 in here as well, being a separate atlas. And remember, this is going to be a bit more performance heavy, but it's going to have a better quality. So again, a balanced game you have to keep in mind. And if you hit allow separate atlases, it's going to create separate atlases in here. And if you disable it, it's going to force all of them into a 0 to 1 UV space using the default. So it really depends on how you, if you want to have a bit of performance loss for having a better quality, you can use this option. And this allow V-wrapping is normally good to be turned on, and it's mainly good for branches. And if the tree has a lot of branches, it's going to place them all and wrap them along the V so that everything gets placed into here. So normally it's good to turn it on. And the next one is separate materials, and sometimes it's going to separate the materials based on if they are two-sided or not. For example, these two-sided materials are different from bark materials. So let me demo that for you. For example, in here we add a trunk. So this trunk doesn't need to be really two-sided, since it's going to have the geometry wrapped around it, and it's going to be a back-face culling material instead. So we do not want to turn the two-sided on this. And this is a simple material that we drag on it. For example, this material. And this material isn't two-sided as well and doesn't have any opacity channel. So when we are going to export the material, it's going to show and look at this two-sided check-on that you place here. And although all of these are going to be wrapped in one single UV space, but if you hit separate material, it's going to, in the target software, for example, in Unreal Engine, it's going to create a separate material for only this, so that it separates the two-sided materials on branch materials, for example. So the two-sided materials are going to be shown for leaves and things like that, for example. If the leaf has 4 polygons and you turn on the two-sided, it's going to make it 8 polygons in the rendering section of Unreal Engine, for example. But instead of that, it's going to show the back face and the front face of the object. For example, let me take this tree and bring it over and look at the two-sided option in here. So let's go to the side, and if you disable it, you're not seeing the material when you're facing the other way. So if you hit two-sided, you are seeing the material no matter which angle you look at. But for something like a tree material or this bark material or branch material, we really do not want the two-sided because it's already covering a lot of it and we're seeing a lot of the mesh when we look around it. So if this one has 600 polygons creating the geometry for it, if we enable the two-sided in the target software, for example, Unreal Engine 5, it's going to have more than 1,200 polygons, making it double the performance. So to separate that, it's going to look at the two-sided and the materials that are not two-sided to separate them so that the material gets optimized a bit more. So the next option is ignore a smooth LOD, and if I set it to UE4, it's going to disable it. But if I set it to be one draw call, it's going to activate it. So why that is, when exporting in formats that allow a smooth LOD, for example, something like this in a SpeedTree, where the geometry gets a bit of animation in LODs, a smoothing, for example, something like this, it's going to create some more draw calls because it's going to calculate these as well. But if you set it to one draw call only, it's going to ignore a smooth LODs, so that the LOD change would be harsher and not so pleasing to look at, but of course a bit more optimized version. So the next option is the geometry, and of course we have talked about it before in the Cinema edition, and this is really dependent on the target software that you're going to export for. If you want to swap Y and Z, or if you want to flip X or Y and Z or anything, it's going to optimize it for the target software. And of course this takes a bit of experimentation for every software that you use to export that so that the transformations get right. And the next option is billboard, and this one says how many faces you want to have when exporting LODs plus billboards. And the default is set to 8, and this is the result of it. The previous one that we looked at, we have 8 different faces, making the transition a lot more smoother. So the next option is the textures, and this is also depending on the needs of your project and the amount of optimization that you want to have. So the first one is packing. The packing is going to be for Unity, Unreal, Lumberyard, or anything else. The format mandatory if you want to use, for example, Targa or JPEG or anything. And the max size is going to be the maximum size for the textures, and Atlas size is going to be the maximum size for the Atlas. And the billboard size, of course, you saw the billboard and how it works. This is going to decide on its resolution. So now, to see these options in action, I'm going to export this into Unreal Engine to see what it works. So before that, I'm going to do a unit conversion. Scene unit conversion. I'm going to convert it from feet to centimeters. And one thing else that we need to do is going in here into preference, tree render, and in here also set it to centimeters so that you get this back. Okay, this is good. So to see if we have a wind or not, we're going to the tools and wind wizard, and in here we're going to set it to grass and okay. So we have a basic wind going on here, and we really do not want to make it so highly strong, because if we make it so strong, because we really do not have a lot of vertices in here, the animation isn't going to be the best possible. Although we're going to use this one for a game, but that doesn't any problems at all. So again, Control and E, and I'm going to make it grass and save. And of course, I'm going to use the ST9 version because this is a lot better for Unreal Engine 4.27 and later on. This is a lot more optimized and a lot better for optimization. So it's saved, doesn't matter. And since this is a simple grass, we do not want to include the billboards on this because this already has a billboard inside. If you remember, we created only a single plane that was two-sided in cutout mesh, so that in far distances it uses that. So for preset, I'm going to use UE4 one draw call, and all LODs is alright. And this is the atlas if you want to change anything. So I'm happy with this. And of course, the resolution for such a tiny grass shouldn't be too much. For example, I'm going to bring it to 2K. The format PNG is alright. And the maximum size, let's set it to 2K. And billboard size, since you do not have it, it doesn't matter. So hit OK so that it gets saved. So here we are in Unreal Engine 5. And this is Unreal Engine 5 preview version. Of course, by the time of this recording, Unreal Engine 5.0 has been released. And it's the stable version. But I haven't downloaded that yet, so we're testing that inside preview. So we're going to bring the content browser up and press this import icon and go over to the directory that we saved them, and this is the grass file that we created. So import, and successfully it created the mesh for us, it created the grass material, and it imported the textures that we needed for that. So let's open up the material, and it's a highly complex, a smart material with a lot of the options that we can use. For example, changing the wind, even changing the textures and things like that. And if you click on this parent material, which this instance has been taken off, this is the absolute material with a lot of complexity in here. And this is because we saved that out as a ST9, which is a newer version, and it's a lot more optimized and has a lot of things, and we can optimize it and create things just the way we want it. So to paint this, we're going to bring it in, and looks like the scaling isn't right. So let me bring up a mannequin. I'm going to the settings and show the engine content and search for mannequin. And looks like we do not have any mannequin in here. So I'm going to bring a cube, and that cube is 1 by 1. So we click on here, and these shapes, I'm bringing a cube. You see this cube is 1 by 1, and this is too huge. So we're going to a speed tree to fix that. Control E again, and looks like the scaling isn't right in here. So I'm going to bring the scaling to 1. It has multiplied the scale by 30, which made it a lot longer and bigger than we expected. So again with the same settings, okay. And then in Unreal Engine, I'm going to right click on the mesh and hit re-import. Now we're seeing the right scale in here. And if I select it and bring the grass material up, using this speed tree shared, you can control the amount of the wind and the speed and things like that. So let's change these randomly to get some wind going on. And this is the wind effect, just like the wind that we had in a speed tree. And of course, using these, you can really fine tune the type of wind that you're getting. And of course, if you want to bring multiple texture outputs and create a new material for yourself that has roughness and things like that, you're free to do so. So I believe we have reached to the end of this lesson. And in the next lesson, we're going to be talking about some of the plugins that make a lot of the process for exporting and importing into different softwares a lot easier. So see you in the next and final lesson.